The private jet carrying CEO Evelyn Harrington jolted hard as alarms shrieked and oxygen masks dropped. Passengers cried out. The captain's voice broke hydraulics offline, altitude bleeding fast. In row 9, a calm, rugged single dad, Nathan Carter, squeezed his daughter Serena's hand, eyes narrowing at the pattern of failures. While Evelyn froze, trapped between power and helplessness, Nathan stood, shoulders squared, requesting access to the cockpit. Nobody aboard knew his past or that the hands of a quiet father once kept combat jets flying. Everything changed. The Gulfstream G650 had departed Chicago Executive Airport at 7:45 that morning, climbing smoothly through layered clouds toward its cruising altitude of 41,000 feet. The flight manifest listed 12 passengers, all bound for a technology summit in San Francisco, where Evelyn Harrington would announce her company's aggressive expansion into aerospace investment. She sat in her preferred seat, 1A, where she could see both forward into the cockpit when the door opened, and back across the cabin she considered an extension of her boardroom. Her red bodycon dress with its signature V-neck had been chosen deliberately, a power statement she'd perfected over years of commanding rooms, filled with men who underestimated her until they saw her quarterly reports. The fabric held its shape perfectly despite hours of wear, much like Evelyn herself maintained composure regardless of pressure. Her laptop displayed confidential acquisition targets, each representing millions in potential revenue, though she'd already memorized every detail. Control was her currency, preparation her weapon, and she wielded both with surgical precision. 3 rows behind her, Nathan Carter helped his 7-year-old daughter Serena with a puzzle book. His large hands, surprisingly gentle, as they guided her small fingers to trace the maze's path. His red and black flannel shirt had seen better days, worn soft from countless washes. The kind of garment that told stories of early morning school runs and late-night homework sessions. His jeans bore the honest wear of actual work, not the artificial distressing of designer denim. Everything about him suggested a man who fixed problems with his hands rather than spreadsheets. Serena possessed that particular brightness found in children who'd experienced loss young enough to understand mortality, but retained enough innocence to find joy despite it. Her stuffed bear, Astrid, occupied the middle seat between them, carefully buckled in, as if it too was a passenger deserving of safety considerations. She'd been explaining to Nathan how airplanes stayed up, her understanding a charming mixture of scientific fact and magical thinking that made him smile despite the slight turbulence that had begun 20 minutes into the flight. Captain William Brooks had noticed the turbulence too, though his 45 years of experience suggested nothing concerning. His silver hair, visible beneath his captain's cap when he'd greeted passengers during boarding, inspired confidence. Beside him, First Officer Liam Reed monitored instruments with the intense focus of someone proving they belonged in the right seat. At 33, Liam had technical knowledge that exceeded many senior pilots, though he sometimes struggled to translate that knowledge into instinct when seconds mattered more than procedures. The first indication of trouble came as a subtle vibration through the control yoke, the kind of feedback that spoke to pilots in a language passengers never learned. William's hands registered the change before his conscious mind processed it, a lifetime of flying encoded in muscle memory that recognized wrongness before instruments confirmed it. The hydraulic pressure gauge for System B began a slow decline, the needle dropping with deceptive laziness that belied the catastrophe it represented. Behind them in the cabin, Amanda Lewis had just finished serving morning refreshments when the aircraft lurched. Her training at 29 included hundreds of hours preparing for emergencies that statistics said would never happen. She'd practiced the motions until they became automatic, but nothing truly prepared someone for the moment when probability became reality. The coffee pot she'd been holding shattered against the galley counter, brown liquid spreading across surfaces she'd kept spotless since takeoff. The master caution light illuminated with a harsh amber glow that painted the cockpit in tones of urgency. William's voice remained steady as he called for the hydraulic failure checklist, his tone betraying nothing of the calculations running through his mind about distances to suitable airports, weather conditions, and the declining controllability of an aircraft losing its lifeblood of pressurized fluid. Liam's fingers flew across the flight management system, pulling up alternatives, while calling out readings that confirmed what William already knew, from the feel of the controls growing heavy in his hands. Nathan felt the change in the aircraft's behavior before any announcement came. Years of working on military aircraft had taught him to read the subtle signs, the particular frequency of vibration that suggested hydraulic cavitation, the slight yaw that indicated asymmetric control surface response, the way the engine's note changed when pilots began using thrust for directional control instead of just propulsion. His hand moved instinctively to check Serena's seatbelt, tightening it without alarming her. His movements casual enough to seem like normal turbulence preparation. Evelyn's first indication that this wasn't routine came when her satellite phone lost connection mid-conversation with her San Francisco team. The device, supposedly capable of maintaining contact anywhere on Earth, delivered only static. She tried twice more before accepting what the rational part of her mind already knew: they were in serious trouble. The loss of communication hit her harder than the physical discomfort of the aircraft's increasingly erratic movement. Her entire professional existence depended on being connected, reachable, able to direct and decide. Suddenly, she was just another passenger in a metal tube, subject to forces beyond her control. The oxygen masks dropped with startling suddenness, their yellow plastic faces swaying like strange fruit in the disturbed air. The automated voice instructing passengers to put on their own masks before assisting others seemed absurdly calm given their circumstances. Around the cabin, reactions varied from silent prayer to barely controlled panic. Henry Moore, a venture capitalist who'd spent the flight until then boasting about his latest acquisition, now gripped his armrest with white knuckles, his earlier bravado evaporating like morning mist. Nathan pulled Serena's mask over her face with practiced efficiency, his own military training making the motion automatic. She looked at him through the clear plastic, her eyes wide but trusting. He signed to her that everything would be okay, a private language they'd developed during her mother's illness when words sometimes failed. She nodded, small hands clutching Astrid tighter. The bear's worn fur a tactile comfort in a world suddenly gone uncertain. Amanda's voice came through the cabin speakers, professionally calm, despite the tremor only trained ears would detect. She instructed passengers on brace positions while simultaneously evaluating who might help and who might hinder in an evacuation. Her eyes found Nathan, noting how he'd positioned himself to protect his daughter while maintaining awareness of everything happening around them. She'd seen panic before in training scenarios, but this man exhibited something different, a coiled readiness that suggested capability rather than fear. The cockpit had become a controlled storm of activity. William fought controls that responded sluggishly, each input requiring more physical effort as hydraulic assistance faded. The aircraft had begun an uncommanded descent, not the smooth, controlled reduction of altitude they'd planned for approach into San Francisco, but an insistent downward trend that suggested systems failing in cascade. Liam's voice grew increasingly strained as he worked through emergency procedures that assumed single-point failures, not the systemic collapse they were experiencing. It was then that Nathan stood. The motion drew immediate attention in a cabin where everyone else remained seated, frozen by fear or protocol. Henry Moore's voice cut through the ambient noise of alarms and prayers. "Sit down, man. This isn't time for heroics. You'll only make things worse." But Nathan's attention had fixed on the overhead panel, visible from his position, where a maintenance access screen displayed diagnostic codes he recognized with chilling clarity. The pattern matched almost exactly a failure cascade he'd seen in F-16s after contaminated hydraulic fluid corroded specific valve seals. He moved forward with purpose that made Amanda step aside instinctively rather than blocking his path. His voice, when he spoke to her, carried quiet authority that came not from position but from knowledge. "I need to speak to the pilots. I can help. Please." The please was courtesy, not supplication. Amanda looked to Evelyn, seeking guidance from the highest-ranking passenger, though protocol didn't cover this situation. Evelyn studied Nathan for a long second, seeing past the working-class clothes to something harder to define competence that couldn't be faked in crisis. Evelyn's nod came with the decisiveness that had built her empire. "If he says he can help, let him try. We're running out of options." The words acknowledged a reality she rarely faced, that her power, influence, and wealth meant nothing against mechanical failure at 40,000 feet. Amanda led Nathan to the cockpit door, entered the emergency access code, and announced his presence to the pilots who were too busy to question why a passenger was being admitted to their sanctuary. Nathan's entrance into the cockpit changed its energy immediately. His eyes swept the instrument panel with the speed of someone reading their native language, processing dozens of indicators in seconds. When he spoke, his words carried the precise technical vocabulary that marked him as anything but ordinary. "Captain, your hydraulic system B is gone. But look at your backup pressure, it's oscillating between 40 and 60 psi. That's classic cavitation from air ingress. You've got a compromised seal in the belly valve assembly. Probably the same manufacturing defect that grounded a bunch of F-16s 8 years ago." William's hands never left the controls, but his voice carried sharp interest. "Your military?" Nathan's response came while he traced hydraulic system schematics on the maintenance display. "Former Air Force. Technical specialist with the 490th Maintenance Squadron. Spent 6 years keeping fighters airborne in places where parts were suggestions and perfect was the enemy of good enough. More importantly, I've seen this exact failure pattern. We can create a bypass, but someone needs to access the technical compartment. Now, the technical compartment beneath the main cabin floor was never designed for in-flight maintenance. The space barely accommodated a person, filled with the arteries and nerves of the aircraft hydraulic lines, electrical bundles, control cables, and environmental systems all competing for space. The temperature exceeded 100 degrees from proximity to the engines and lack of proper ventilation. Hydraulic fluid had begun seeping from compromised fittings, creating a slippery, toxic environment that would challenge someone in proper protective equipment, much less a man in jeans and flannel. Nathan lowered himself into the space with Amanda and another flight attendant, Marcus Wells, holding his legs to prevent him from sliding too far into the mechanical maze. The noise was overwhelming wind rushing past gaps in the pressure vessel, hydraulic pumps struggling against failing systems, and the deep throb of engines transmitting vibration through every surface. His hands worked by feel as much as sight, tracing lines he'd studied in technical manuals years before, knowledge that had seemed obsolete until this moment when it might save 12 lives. The primary hydraulic accumulator had catastrophically failed. Its internal bladder ruptured in a way that dumped all stored pressure instantly. The backup system's problem was more subtle, but equally dangerous. Microscopic contamination had created a one-way valve effect in a critical junction, allowing air to enter but preventing proper fluid flow. The fix wouldn't meet any certification standard, but certification standards assumed ground-level repairs with proper tools, not emergency interventions at altitude with whatever could be scrounged from a galley. Using cable ties normally meant for securing catering supplies, Nathan began creating a bypass that would route hydraulic fluid around the contaminated section. The heat-resistant tape Amanda had found in the emergency kit became gaskets and seals. Plastic stirrers from the bar service, broken and shaped with his pocket knife, became improvised check valves. It was the kind of engineering that would horrify anyone who hadn't seen combat maintenance, where the only standard that mattered was whether it worked long enough to get home. Blood seeped from cuts on Nathan's arms, where sharp edges had claimed their price for working in confined spaces during turbulence. The hydraulic fluid burned where it contacted broken skin, but he'd experienced worse in desert maintenance bays, where the choice was often between perfect safety and keeping aircraft mission-capable. His movements remained precise despite the pain, each connection critical to creating a system that might hold together just long enough. Above in the cabin, Evelyn found herself drawn to Serena, who sat with remarkable composure for a 7-year-old facing potential disaster. The child's faith in her father was absolute, the kind of trust that came from never having been disappointed when it mattered. Evelyn sat beside her, ignoring the hydraulic fluid that would stain her expensive dress, and asked about the bear named Astrid. Serena's explanation came in the matter-of-fact tone children used for important truths. "Daddy gave her to me when Mommy went to heaven. She helps when I'm scared. But Daddy's fixing the airplane, so we'll be okay." The simple certainty in that statement hit Evelyn harder than any board presentation ever had. This child's entire world rested on faith that her father would solve the problem, would make them safe, would come back from that mechanical hell below and smile like he always did. It was trust Evelyn had never given anyone, having learned early that control was safer than faith, that depending on others invited disappointment. Yet here was proof that sometimes surrender to another's expertise was the only path to survival. Nathan's voice crackled through the intercom he'd rigged using an emergency handset. "Captain, I need precise coordination here. When I call Mark, cycle the backup pump 3 times. 5-second intervals. Liam, you'll need to adjust trim to compensate for asymmetric response. We're going to be flying this bird like a Vietnam-era Huey, with battle damage ugly but functional. The bypass is holding, but it's temporary. We need to find somewhere to put down within 30 minutes. Maybe 40 if we're lucky. The cockpit became a symphony of coordination, three men who'd never worked together before finding rhythm born of necessity. William's decades of experience translated Nathan's unconventional solutions into control inputs. Liam's theoretical knowledge found practical application in calculating exactly how much trim compensation each asymmetric thrust adjustment required. Nathan called out pressure readings from below, his voice steady despite the physical ordeal of maintaining position in the cramped space while manually holding certain connections closed. When Nathan finally emerged from the compartment, he looked like he'd been through combat. His flannel shirt was torn in multiple places, soaked with sweat and hydraulic fluid. Blood marked where he'd sacrificed skin to sharp metal. His hands shook slightly from exertion and adrenaline decline, but his eyes remained sharp, focused on the next problem. He moved immediately to the cockpit. Ignoring Amanda's attempts to tend his injuries, there would be time for medical attention if they survived. If not, bandages were irrelevant. The weather had deteriorated dramatically during their mechanical crisis. The storm system they'd planned to fly over had developed faster than forecast, its tops reaching above their current altitude. Lightning flickered in clouds that looked solid enough to walk on, while turbulence reports from other aircraft painted a picture of severe conditions between them and any suitable landing site. The nearest appropriate runway was Larissa Field, 90 miles south, but reaching it meant penetrating weather that would challenge a fully functional aircraft. Alexandra Pierce had watched everything with the analytical mind that made her Evelyn's most trusted technical advisor. Her tablet had been calculating probabilities, running scenarios, evaluating options with cold mathematical precision. The numbers were clear. Their chances of survival decreased with each passing minute. The bypass Nathan had created was a masterpiece of improvisation, but it was fighting physics and time, both implacable opponents. She found herself doing something she hadn't done since childhood, praying to a god she'd replaced with algorithms that the impossible might prove possible just this once. Nathan studied the weather radar with the intensity of someone reading tea leaves for fate. He'd flown through worse weather in military aircraft designed for combat stress, but this civilian jet with compromised controls would handle like a freight train on ice. The key would be finding gaps, those brief windows where conditions might allow passage. His finger traced a possible route on the display, marking where wind patterns suggested momentary lessening of turbulence, where precipitation might be rain instead of hail, where they might thread between the worst cells. The approach to Larissa Field would require perfection from imperfect systems and exhausted humans. The runway was oriented badly for the prevailing winds, meaning they'd face significant crosswind components during landing. The hydraulic bypass limited their ability to deploy flaps and slats normally, reducing lift and increasing approach speed. They'd have one-chance go-arounds required hydraulic pressure they couldn't spare. Every soul aboard would live or die based on decisions made in the next 15 minutes. William's voice carried the weight of command when he addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our approach to Larissa Field. The landing will be rough. Follow all crew instructions immediately and completely." To his crew and Nathan, he added more quietly, "This is going to be very close. Everyone needs to be perfect. No margins for error." Nathan nodded, understanding that William was acknowledging they might not survive, giving everyone a moment to make peace with that possibility before the final act began. The descent through the storm challenged every skill the three men possessed. Wind shear tried to flip them inverted. Hail hammered the windscreen with sounds like automatic weapon fire. Lightning struck so close they could smell ozone through the ventilation system. The bypass held but barely, pressure fluctuating wildly, as the improvised seals flexed under loads they were never designed to handle. Nathan called adjustments in real time, his voice a steady counterpoint to the chaos, translating mechanical feedback into control inputs that kept them roughly on course. At 10,000 feet, they broke through the first cloud layer into relative clear air, though rain still reduced visibility to barely acceptable minimums. Larissa Field appeared as runway lights bleeding through water, a promise of solid ground that seemed impossibly distant. The tower had cleared all traffic. Emergency vehicles lined the runway edges like an honor guard of red and white lights. Everyone watching knew this would be either a miracle or a tragedy, with very little room between those outcomes. The hydraulic bypass failed partially at 3,000 feet. The sound was distinctive, a sharp crack followed by the whistle of high-pressure fluid escaping. Nathan didn't need instruments to know they'd just lost half their remaining control authority. His mind ran calculations faster than any computer, weighing options in microseconds. He made the call that would haunt him if they survived, and wouldn't matter if they didn't. Lock the rudder neutral. We'll steer with engines only. Gear down now while we still have pressure. This is going to be rough. The landing gear extended asymmetrically, the nose wheel descending normally, while the main gear required manual backup systems. The imbalance created drag that pulled them left, requiring constant right engine thrust to maintain alignment. Liam's hands flew over throttle controls, making adjustments measured in single percentage points. Too much compensation, and they'd accelerate past safe landing speed. Too little, and they'd drift off the runway into terrain that would shred the aircraft. 1,000 feet. The automated call-out seemed absurdly calm. 500 feet. Serena's voice carried through the tension, not crying, but singing softly, a lullaby her mother used to sing. The sound cut through fear like light through darkness, reminding everyone that life continued despite mechanical failure, that humanity persisted in the face of technical catastrophe. Even hardened business travelers found themselves listening to that small voice, drawing strength from a child's faith that stories could still have happy endings. Minimums. Minimums. The runway appeared and disappeared through sheets of rain. William's arms ached from fighting controls that wanted to do anything but what he commanded. Nathan called final adjustments, his voice hoarse from breathing hydraulic fumes and shouting over mechanical noise. 50 feet. 30 feet. 20 feet. The ground rushed up with startling speed. William pulled back on controls that responded like they were moving through molasses. The main gear touched hard enough to compress the struts to their stops. The nose wheel slammed down with an impact that threw everyone forward against their restraints. The aircraft veered left as the crosswind caught their tall tail surfaces. William and Nathan fought together, one calling out drift angles while the other applied opposite thrust. The edge lights passed frighteningly close on the left side. Thrust reversers deployed asymmetrically. Only the right engine providing meaningful deceleration. They used every inch of runway, stopping just 300 feet from the overrun area. For 30 seconds, nobody moved or spoke. The only sounds were the tick of cooling metal and the distant wail of approaching sirens. Then Amanda's training kicked in, her voice professional despite the tears streaming down her face as she initiated evacuation procedures. The slides deployed, passengers evacuating into rain that felt like baptism after their descent through hell. Each person who reached the ground safely turned to help the next, strangers bonded by shared survival into something resembling family. Nathan emerged from the aircraft last, carrying Serena, who refused to let go of his neck. His legs nearly buckled when they hit solid ground, exhaustion finally claiming its due. William was there immediately, supporting him with the quiet strength of one professional recognizing another. In 30 years of flying, William said simply, "I've never seen anything like what you just did. You saved us all." Nathan's response came through cracked lips and a throat raw from fumes. "We saved us all. Every person who stayed calm, who trusted, who did their part. That's the only reason we're standing here." Evelyn approached through the rain. Her designer dress ruined, her carefully styled hair plastered to her head, yet somehow maintaining the presence that commanded boardrooms. She looked at Nathan holding his daughter, at William and Liam supporting each other, at Amanda organizing passengers with quiet efficiency despite her own trauma. These people, connected by circumstance and catastrophe, had achieved something impossible through trust and cooperation. It was a lesson worth more than any acquisition her company might make. The investigation that followed revealed exactly what Nathan had diagnosed: a manufacturing defect in valve assemblies, invisible to standard inspections, affecting dozens of aircraft across multiple airlines. His field repair, documented in detail, became a case study in emergency engineering. The FAA incorporated his bypass technique into emergency procedures, potentially saving lives in future similar failures. The valve manufacturer faced massive recalls and lawsuits, their cost-cutting measures exposed as potentially lethal compromises. But the real story emerged in quieter moments. Nathan's background investigation, initiated by Alexandra's insatiable need for data, revealed a man who'd been brilliant enough for any career, but chose service over profit. His military record showed commendations for innovations that kept aircraft flying in combat zones where replacement parts were fantasies and perfect repairs, impossible dreams. After his wife's death, he'd walked away from six-figure consulting offers to ensure Serena never doubted she was his priority. Evelyn's company restructured its aviation division based on Nathan's recommendations. She hired him not as an employee but as an independent safety consultant with unprecedented authority to halt any operation he deemed unsafe. His workshops didn't resemble corporate training mechanics, and executives worked side by side, learning that hydraulic fluid under fingernails often indicated more expertise than PowerPoint presentations. He insisted that every decision-maker spend time in maintenance bays, understanding the machines they profited from at a mechanical level. The anniversary of their landing passed with Nathan and Serena at their usual Saturday routine breakfast at a local diner where the waitress knew their orders, then to Nathan's shop, where he taught neighborhood kids basic mechanics for free. Evelyn appeared unexpectedly, driving herself rather than using her usual driver, wearing jeans and a simple sweater rather than her corporate armor. She brought coffee and donuts, the kind of simple gesture that would have seemed beneath her before she learned that competence and character didn't always come in expected packages. Serena had grown in that year, still carrying Astrid but with new confidence born from surviving the worst and seeing her father recognized for the hero she'd always known him to be. She showed Evelyn her latest project, a mechanical drawing of an aircraft hydraulic system, labeled in her careful child's handwriting with notes about redundancy and backup systems. Nathan's influence was clear, but so was her own emerging understanding that complex problems required both knowledge and intuition to solve. The shop filled with neighbors as word spread that Evelyn Harrington was there. Not the CEO whose company's valuation had doubled in the past year, but the woman who'd learned that survival sometimes meant surrendering control to those with dirty hands and practical knowledge. She helped Nathan explain hydraulic principles to a 12-year-old who dreamed of becoming a pilot, her corporate vocabulary adapting to meet young minds where they were rather than expecting them to rise to her level. That evening, as the sun set through the shop windows, Nathan shared something he'd never told anyone. During those moments in the technical compartment, burning his hands on hot metal and breathing toxic fumes, he'd heard his late wife's voice telling him Serena still needed him, that his work wasn't done. Whether grief-induced hallucination or something more, it had given him strength to continue when his body wanted to quit. Evelyn understood. She'd heard her own voice of clarity during the crisis. A recognition that all her power meant nothing if she couldn't trust others' expertise when it mattered most. The transformation went beyond individuals. William Brooks became an advocate for practical emergency training that went beyond simulator scenarios. Liam Reed developed new protocols that balanced theoretical knowledge with instinct development. Amanda Lewis redesigned crew emergency procedures based on passenger psychology rather than just regulatory requirements. Each person touched by that flight carried forward lessons written in adrenaline and survival, spreading ripples of change through an industry that often resisted change until catastrophe demanded it. Nathan's consulting work identified 17 critical failure points across various aircraft models, each one a potential disaster prevented. He insisted on anonymity in public reports. But within the industry, his name became synonymous with the kind of practical expertise that transcended credentials. Young mechanics sought him out, learning that understanding why systems failed was as important as knowing how they should work. His shop became an informal academy where knowledge passed from scarred hands to eager minds. The relationship between Nathan and Evelyn evolved slowly, built on respect rather than attraction, though attraction eventually followed respect. They were an unlikely pair, the CEO who commanded through power and the mechanic who led through knowledge. Yet they found common ground in their dedication to excellence and their understanding that true strength sometimes meant acknowledging weakness. Serena accepted Evelyn's presence with the adaptability of children who judge people by their actions rather than their titles. 3 years after the emergency landing, a new aircraft rolled out featuring revolutionary safety systems inspired by Nathan's work. The manufacturers wanted to name it after him, but he declined, suggesting instead it be called the Phoenix, representing not just survival, but transformation through trial. At the unveiling, He stood in the background while executives spoke, his hand holding Serena's, now 10, and aspiring to be an aerospace engineer who would design systems her father would approve. Evelyn gave the keynote address, surprising everyone by speaking not about profit margins or market share but about trust. She told the story of their flight, of a single father who'd saved 12 lives with cable ties and coffee stirrers, of pilots who'd accepted unconventional solutions, or of passengers who'd maintained composure despite facing death. Her message was simple but revolutionary for corporate aviation: that safety wasn't just about compliance, but about empowering those with practical knowledge to override theoretical limitations when lives hung in the balance. The speech ended with Evelyn calling Nathan forward, though he tried to resist. The audience engineers, executives, pilots, mechanics, stood in sustained applause for a man who exemplified what aviation should aspire to: competence without ego, courage without bravado, expertise that crossed boundaries between blue-collar and white-collar. Nathan's brief words thanked everyone who'd trusted him that day, but emphasized that survival had been collective, not individual. Every person doing their part, from pilots to passengers, had made the impossible possible. As the ceremony concluded, Serena tugged Nathan's hand, leading him to the new aircraft, where she wanted to examine the hydraulic systems he'd influenced. Evelyn walked with them, her heels clicking on the hangar floor, a sound that once symbolized corporate distance, now representing partnership. They climbed into the aircraft together, Nathan explaining improvements to Serena while Evelyn listened, learning that sometimes the most important conversations happened not in boardrooms, but in the presence of machines that carried human lives through invisible air. The sun set through the hangar's massive doors, painting the aircraft gold and red, colors that reminded them all of that morning when death had seemed certain until knowledge, trust, and determination proved stronger than mechanical failure. Nathan lifted Serena to see into the cockpit, where improved hydraulic gauges displayed triple redundancy systems. Her reflection in the glass showed a child who'd learned early that heroes didn't always wear uniforms, that strength came in many forms, and that sometimes the most important person in any room was the one who knew how to fix what was broken. The story of their flight became legend in aviation circles, taught in safety courses and maintenance programs worldwide. But for those who lived it, the lesson was simpler and more profound. When everything depends on trusting others' expertise, when control must yield to competence, when survival requires surrendering ego to ability, humanity finds its finest expression. Nathan returned to his shop, Evelyn to her boardroom, but both carried forward the understanding that greatness often wore work clothes and spoke with quiet authority earned through scars rather than degrees. In the end, 12 people landed safely not because of any single hero, but because catastrophe revealed the heroism present in ordinary people doing extraordinary things when circumstances demanded it. The private jet that had carried a CEO's ambitions became instead a classroom where power learned to yield to knowledge, where a child's faith proved stronger than fear, and where a humble man's expertise saved lives that money and influence alone could never have protected. That transformation, more than survival itself, was the true miracle of Flight 873. A reminder that in our most vulnerable moments, we discover what strength really means.